Dudes podcast. Once again, we are going to do a special live stream. This is one that we've been advertising for quite some time. We're going to talk about addressing the future of abortion and the pro life movement here in Canada. We've talked to American pro lifers, and last
Yep,
Thursday we had a special discussion where we were talking about debunking pro abortion memes. But tonight
that
is
was
the
fun.
discussion where we are going to address how we move forward in a post Roe Canada and how we get
Hmm.
the churches more involved in helping progress the pro life movement along. So tonight we have two very special guests. We have Jojo Ruba.
Hmm.
Jojo has been a former guest on the show. I interviewed him a couple years ago, and he's always been a very good friend of ours. We
That's
look up to
solid.
him. He's a leader here in Canada as far as pro life and Christian apologetics,
Yeah.
and we really appreciate having him on the show.
Hmm.
And
Hey
then our
guys.
other guest in the top right hand corner is Robin. Robin attends our church and she runs the pro life ministry that our church operates outside of the abortion clinic here in Calgary.
Hmm.
So thank you both for attending. And I'll get you to kind of introduce yourselves just quickly while I do some social media promotion.
Yeah, I'll take this part here, Stephen.
Go
So,
for it.
so Jojo, who are you? Tell us about yourself.
Well, I was born a very long time ago. No, in terms of this topic, in terms
Yeah.
of this topic, I've been doing pro-life work since I was 13, which is a very long time ago.
Mhm.
And I actually went into journalism school and did my master's in political science with the intent of using those skills to do pro-life activism. I did my master's degree actually on the history of the pro-life movement in Canada, and did a comparative analysis of the legal and political situation at the time between Canada and the United States when it came to the abortion debate.
Hmm. You also rub shoulders with a lot of most of the pro-life leaders in the country, don't you?
Yeah, no, I helped start the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform in Canada, and obviously, and have brought through that organization with the great team that we had, pro-life apologetics training, which a
Hmm.
lot of it probably you use. I'm sorry I didn't hear your last podcast, but the stuff that we are teaching are the things that I think almost every pro-life organization in Canada is using.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
right.
I would credit is one of the key reasons why Roe versus Wade was overturned. We can talk about that after.
Yeah, we are definitely your disciples, Jojo. All hail the mighty Jojo. All hail. Thank you so much for all your hard work, man.
Yeah.
And our other guest, Robin, tell us who are you, and what connection do you have to the pro-life movement?
I've been involved with pro-life stuff since I was 15, which is 10 years ago.
Mm.
So not as long as you, Jojo, but still from when I was pretty young.
Just working on
Mhm.
it.
And
Absolutely.
before then, so my father actually spent time in jail over blocking the doors of an abortion clinic in Vancouver when he was a young man.
Hmm.
And so this is kind of run in our family. Not going to jail, but uh, the pro-life movement. But yeah, so I was generically interested in it throughout when I was a kid. My older brother, who is adopted, came from a mother who had to fight extraordinarily hard to keep him alive throughout her pregnancy
Yeah.
because she was in the care of the state and they tried extremely hard to force an abortion upon her.
Hmm. That's
And
terrible.
yeah, so I actually was working for Jason Kenney's campaign in when I was 15. Well, I wasn't officially an employee of it, but I was like working for someone who's working for him.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so I'm deeply disappointed in him in general, but I was doing a
Mhm.
lot of pro-life, started doing pro-life research at that point.
Hmm.
And then I volunteered for a pregnancy care center for a stretch of time in Cochrane. And I just really was like I appreciate the pregnancy care centers hugely. They do great work. But it
Yeah.
also really burdened me how they're painfully tied up in regulations. Like
Hmm.
Mhm.
Mhm.
the government's really, yeah, it's really just bound them up and muzzled them for the large part. Like they can
It's
barely even say that
it's not,
abortion is wrong.
Right.
it's almost like they're
And
not really pro-choice, are they?
Yeah,
The government.
pro-life. Yeah. But
Well,
but
I
yeah,
wouldn't.
so it was they are pro-life,
Mhm,
and like they try to work with what they can,
mhm,
but it really is they are up against it, and there are
mhm,
some things. It depends from center to center. I know some centers that take stronger stances than others, but
Mhm.
some have largely capitulated to taking a very backseat
Hmm.
position. Not position on abortion, but like a backseat role,
Mhm.
which they were basically forced into. But it just really came to my heart that I felt like we need to do more, and that's why we started Imago Dei Ministries from our
Hmm.
church in
That's cool.
September 2020, and
Mhm.
we've stockpiled stuff for women. We've got housing set up and everything. We haven't had much go on yet. I have helped one woman. I've personally helped just the one woman, but
Mhm.
we also stand outside the abortion clinic and hold signs and proclaim the truth of what abortion is.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were joking when we were talking to our American guests. We were joking like, you know, like, hey, you should show them like more love. Maybe like bring a whole container of cupcakes and be like, hey, we love you. Toss them across the street to them. Be like, hey, here's some cupcakes. You know, be like that might not
yeah.
come across that we
They
will.
would think we poisoned them.
Yeah, and
Most
you'd be
likely,
arrested for doing that.
Yeah, you would.
most
Yeah.
likely.
Mhm.
Oh,
That's yeah,
undoubtedly.
yeah.
Without
The
any doubt.
pro-choice side tends to not have a sense of humor, so fair enough.
Yeah. No,
They never
the
really
pro-choice
did.
side tends to not support choice for anybody else except for abortion. So
Yes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well,
opposite.
I was reading, like, just talking about this, not preferring any choice aside from abortion, but there was a story. Well, it was by Laura Clausen, who one day we're going to get her on the show. But there was an incident where she was raising money and she was doing some funding for this struggling young mother and her child because her family had rejected her because she went into the abortion clinic and then chose to walk out.
Mhm.
And so, because she had chosen to walk out, her family and her boyfriend all turned her down. And then she somehow found Laura Clausen, and now they're funding a baby registry for her.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And anyone who's stood outside an abortion clinic will watch. And Robin, you can verify this if it's not true. Let me know. But you can watch women coming in with
Mm-hmm.
often their moms or they're by
Yeah.
themselves. But if they're with a partner or the man comes, drives by, drops them off, and
Yeah.
then leaves.
Mhm.
So the
Yes,
support,
that's 100%.
yeah.
The
So the support
secret
there
hidden.
is
Yeah.
the support is only limited to the abortion.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest lesser well known things, and I think like we were talking earlier about a debate between Lila Rose, who is a very prominent pro life activist in the United States, and a lady named I forget her name. She's a pro choice
Brenda. Yeah, I just remember her first name, Brenda.
friend. Yeah. So they had a big debate on this podcast, and one of the things that that Lila Rose was bringing up, and I was like, I thought that was a very good point, is she was bringing up the hidden side that most of the time the pro choice side never wants to address, and in particular, she thought the lady Brenda brought up the idea of like like the very common talking point, which is that it's like, oh, what about like a 10-year-old who gets pregnant? And Lila Rose made a good point. She was like, well, if that's the case, if the 10-year-old is pregnant, that is most likely, most majority of the time, that is due to abuse or incest. And I'm like, and so we should be looking into that rather than just giving a quick like band-aid solution. We should be looking into like what is the cause and how did this happen? Because a lot of times abortion is used to hide the crime, and too
It's a
often
cover up.
it's a
Right.
cover up, right? It's a very big secret in the abortion movement. So, quick question for you guys, and I'll start with JoJo. So, and this is a question that I wanted to ask you both about. So, in the United States, obviously Roe v. Wade was a big victory. Like this took years and years of effort, a lot of lobbying, a lot of like pro-life support for political campaigns and all that. And obviously, this was a big victory for the pro-life movement in the United States. Now, obviously, we've seen how that movement has like spilled over into that. Sorry, that victory has spilled over into Canada. We see like pro-abortion rallies, and sometimes people are like, well, why are they like rallying here? Because we have like unlimited abortion. Now, the question I have for you, obviously, as pro-lifers, we're very happy to see such a big win for the pro-life movement. Do you believe that the overturning of Roe in the United States will be a detriment to the pro-life movement here in Canada, or will it be a positive, something that will actually help the pro-life movement? The reason I ask is because of Roe, a lot of the pro-abortion activists are pushing even harder to try to create even more barriers. And yet, whereas at the same time, a lot of pro-lifers are encouraged, and the conversation is now launching, and so we're actually having these conversations. So, do you think it's a detriment to the pro-life movement, or do you think it's it's going to be galvanize the pro-life side and maybe make more opportunities? Let's start with you, Jojo. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's probably both. I think that's the right answer. When we, excuse me, when we think about where the debate is in Canada, the challenge isn't even the legal situation of abortion. The challenge is, are we even allowed to have a debate? Right? The elite media, when you're protesting there, Robin, I'm assuming you have to face the injunction, the court injunction here, and the codification of abortion access, so that even simply speaking out against it can be potentially criminalized, or you can go to jail, depending on how many people are standing in front of the abortion clinic here in Calgary. So the government, the federal Liberal government, has already said that they will remove charitable status from pregnancy centers, particularly because they lie. And this is all talking points from pro-abortion, radical pro-abortion groups. And what the government wants to do now is to codify access to abortion, so it's actually harder to change the law. Because when the Canadian Supreme Court ruled on the Morgenthaler decision, it actually never made a case for any kind of law. It actually asked for a law. And the conservative government of the day tried to pass a law, but it was never passed. And we can talk about that. And so we actually have no law. And what that means, and I think your listeners need to understand this, the United States law, that's the Dobbs decision, protected the right of Mississippi to make a law banning abortion after 15 weeks. The other side lost their minds on that. Especially making the argument this is restricting women's rights, blah, blah, blah. We know how crazy that argument is when you just look at the laws in Europe. Germany and France ban abortion before 15 weeks, for example. And the only countries that don't ban abortion at any time during pregnancy are countries like China, Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam. So that's the group that we're part of.
We're buddies.
Canada doesn't just have legal abortion up to the moment of birth, but the public pays for it. So what the abortion advocates want now is that we must agree with their view. And we can see that in the last, not the last election, but the election before that, when Andrew Scheer was running for prime minister. And during the election, the debates, one of the debates, all the other leaders basically told Scheer, you must be pro-abortion in order to be prime minister of Canada. That's where we're at right now. And so this decision will empower that movement to persecute pro-lifers and, frankly, anyone who disagrees with their elitist views even more. And in terms of pro-life activism, that gives hope. I think that is true as well for those of us in the movement. However, we also have to ask ourselves a critical question, Danny, which is why, after 49 years, has the U.S. pro-life movement succeeded and Canada's pro-life movement has basically got worse in our situation?
Gotten a little more, it's gotten a little less. It doesn't have as much momentum as the American one, for sure.
I'd be grave to ask what momentum do we have, at least on the political side of things. I don't think. I think it's actually worse.
Well, I think it's poignant to say that, like, in the area of momentum, like in the United States, it's like, okay, well, we're focusing on overturning Roe, and then suddenly all these things will take place.
Yeah.
But here in Canada, we have, and for those who don't know, we have an organization in Canada called We Need a Law. Not we need stricter laws, not we need a law banning it after this time. We need a law.
Period.
There is no laws. And so there's such a progression, there's such a distance that we have to cover to even come close to what the Americans have achieved in the past 49 years. And yeah, that's why we're doing this events, because we're trying to assess how we already know how far we need to go, but we're trying to assess how we get there and what's the best course of action.
And frankly, the number of, and just to finish off my point before you go on, the vast majority of Americans, it's over 70%, support the Mississippi law when asked when they'd like to draw the line, which is around 15 weeks.
Yeah.
So even if they call themselves pro-choice, and we need to understand the pro-choice view says abortion should be legal at any time during pregnancy over the 9 months for any reason or for no reason at all, and you must pay for it.
It's just the woman's choice, Jojo. It's the woman's choice.
Yeah, but we have no choice to whether or not we want to fund it, right? So that's why I think the more accurate term is pro-abortion, not pro-choice, because really the only choice they're defending is abortion.
You can tell they don't like that term, though. Whenever you bring it up, they're like, "Oh, we don't like being called that," but they'll happily call you anti-choice or
and I think
whatever.
it depends who you're talking to, but I think your audience in this case, if they're Christians mostly, need to truly understand the extent of the extremism on the other side, because you're never going to hear that from the CBC or on any media.
No.
Even in Canada, the vast majority of Canadians do not support, for example, aborting a baby just because she's a girl.
Yeah.
Or they don't support late-term abortions, right? So the fear, there is a fear factor among the elitist in our Canadian society, the media, the politicians, that opening up the conversation will actually reveal the fact that the majority of Canadians do not support this radical view.
They need to protect.
So rather than actually going through the nitty-gritty details of what the Mississippi law is, again, the Mississippi law is more liberal than Germany and France's law. Just think about that.
It's a little more
so it's less protective of preborn children. So these protective laws, I don't like them call them restrictions. These are protective laws that ban abortion. They're not perfect. I think if the preborn child, as you talked about likely last week, is a child, then they need legal protection just like anybody else at whatever stage, at whatever age. However, as you said, Stephen, we have to start somewhere, and I think this is a good place to start in these conversations. That at the very least, let's protect the children we can that the majority of Canadians and Americans would like to protect, and phrasing it that way is critical. Because if you're asked if you're pro-choice, well, of course, everyone wants to be pro-choice.
Yeah, because they don't want to offend.
The challenge we need to push back is no, actually, everyone's also anti-choice if the choice that's made is lethal.
Yeah. I want to bring Robin into this. For Robin, tell me, based on your experiences, both like early on and even more currently and all that, how do you feel about the Canadian pro-life movement? And particularly, do you see any major differences between the movement here and the one in the States? What are your thoughts on the movement and its status right now in Canada?
Well, I would say for one thing, the pro-life movement in Canada is much, much smaller percentage-wise than in the States, way smaller. I mean, I was looking at a list just the other day of pro-life organizations in the States, and I was flipping pages.
Yeah.
And there are no pages to flip here if you're making a list of that. But that's partially a reflection of the fact that the Christian population of our nation is much smaller than in the States also, percentage-wise. But
so maybe unpack that a little bit for us, Robin. In terms of churches, how do you feel that the churches are doing in Canada as far as the pro-life movement? What's your are they doing much? Are they doing very little? Do you feel like they're
the majority are utterly failing?
Okay, how so?
The majority are utterly failing. The majority of churches, because of our church's situation, we've had a lot of people come from a great variety of church backgrounds into our church lately. And
Mhm.
from them, we've
Including
had
us.
enormous
Including
mixed
us.
responses to the fact we have our pro-life ministry.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
And it's because of the way they were taught. Like, I've had no one who's like emphatically opposed to the pro-life movement,
Mhm.
but a lot of people who think that we should reel it back, think we should be
Hmm.
much more cautious and much less bold in our approach, and that we should just give a little bit more extra money to some pro-life organizations instead of trying to actually take any action ourselves.
Mm. So, like,
And
the idea is
the
that we
majority
should
of
let someone
churches,
else do it?
what was that?
The idea is that they advocate that someone else should do it, not us.
Yes, that it's not our responsibility. There's no sense of the individual responsibility with it. There's also the majority of churches, you will never hear abortion mentioned from the pulpit.
Mm-hmm. That is
Vast
true.
majority. You'll hear it more in Catholic churches than in
Yep.
evangelical
It's
churches,
true.
which is to our shame.
It's
Mm-hmm.
true. My mom is a very devout Catholic, and so is my sister. And I do, when we talk about pro-life movement, that's one of the things I always say. I mean, I have a lot of like issues with the Catholic Church. I don't reject them outright. I don't think that they're all like non-Christians. I wouldn't even say that most of them are non-Christian. But among all those things, I do acknowledge that Catholics have always been very much more adamant in their pro-life advocacy than a lot of Protestant churches, which I think you're right on that. So, like, what do you think needs to happen in the church in Canada in order to make some changes?
Mostly the pastors need to pick up a little bit of courage here and actually be willing to address a political issue from the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think every Christian I've ever talked to, and I use the term Christian fairly narrowly here because, as we know, it's
Yeah.
used extremely broadly.
Mm-hmm.
But every
Mhm.
Christian I've talked to who was of a very dismissive stance, like you hear a lot of the like, well, I don't think abortion's good, but I've never been in that situation. I know it's really complicated and I don't know what I would do. But when you actually talk with them across the board, everyone I've talked with comes around to the same position that I am once we talk, well, of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
just that most have never been exposed to this. They've never like considered, if this is a baby being killed,
Mm-hmm.
what how can I keep my mouth shut?
Yeah.
I think a big problem, and maybe you can let me know if you agree. A big problem is twofold, and you guys can let me know what you think about this. One is that I believe that we somewhere along the line, I'm not sure when it was. Maybe Stephen knows this better than I do, but somewhere along the line, the church adopted a stance that we like somehow we need to be avoid being political, and political meant anything like we can't delve into politics, but that line has been so eroded to the point where not being political means you can't get involved in anything that the government has taken from the church. And I think that that's one problem that Christians somehow believe, like even the line from the states, oh, it's separation of church and state. We like the church should stay out of the government's, issues, whatever. And the second thing is that a lot of Christians, I believe, and I've talked to people like this, a lot of Christians have bought the lie that if you are a good little Christian, you can offend. And if you offend someone, you're not being a good Christian. Actually, I even ran into somebody today in this one comment. They basically said, like, oh, you guys are like, causing problem and hurting people's feelings, that you're like, you're bad Christians. And I'm like, I run into this all the time. The idea is that Christians are told, oh, we're Christians, so we can't offend people. And two, oh, we're Christians, so we can't get political. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that that's part of the problem in the church thinking?
Hugely.
How so, Robin?
Yeah, I would say that's central to it. And it's
What?
ultimately the whole like we should not offend is ultimately nothing but cowardice. That's at the root
Mm-hmm.
of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because anyone who reads scripture reads of the offense of the cross. They read of preaching the word, whipping up mobs, whipping up murderous mobs. And no one can read the Bible or church history and walk away thinking that Christianity is supposed to be non-offensive.
Mhm.
Well, every time the disciples went to a city in the book of Acts, they stirred up a crowd
Yep.
that hated their message.
Mhm.
So if you want to join a religion that doesn't offend anyone, it's not
It's
Christianity.
not this one.
You should join something else.
Well, I'm even reading right
I
now. I'm reading right now through John, and John had this very long tirade with the Jews in like the middle chapters, and I was like, "Dang, he's real. Like he's actually like, you're trying to kill me." It's like, "Huh, you're possessed by a demon. Who's trying to kill you?" Like you can tell, like he's being confrontational, and these people are
oh,
getting
and
very offended by what he's saying.
yeah, no, and the other part, and Robin, you're absolutely right. I agree. It's fear is one, and we can see that with all the major issues from sexuality to relativism, to even defending scripture, we have a very much a culture in Canada of being afraid. Part of it is our politeness, right? So in the U.S., where they're
Yep.
much more frank. In
Sorry,
Canada, particularly the Christian church, we aren't willing to rock the boat. This is true when I was in the East Coast. A lot of the people there knew their neighbors, and so they wanted to be nice to their neighbors, and they've
Yeah.
equated being a Christian with being nice. And that's the other part, actually, Danny, to your question. I think what we've actually done is lost our ability to truly love our neighbors,
Yeah.
right? Jesus specifically said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me."
Mhm.
And so if we think about what we're saying when we talk about abortion, why are we against abortion? Because it kills an innocent human child. Who
Mhm.
else is more orphans than that child whose mother and father they've already decided is not worth living? So these are the orphans in our generation now. What did Jesus say about widows and orphans? Right? So how the church is treating the preborn child and her family is indicative of what they think about Jesus. That's Jesus' own words.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I think one thing that's so like I'll just throw this in because a lot of people I talk to don't realize this, and particularly I love to use this with people who are non-Christian who like to throw this out as a proof text against Christians. They say like, "Oh, you're a Christian, so you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself." I'm like, "Oh, did you know that Jesus was quoting the Old Testament in that?" He's like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah."
Yeah.
So this is from Leviticus 19 verse 18,
Mhm.
and like funny enough, when he's that whole quotation, one verse before it says you need to confront people directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. That is literally the verse before that. I'm
Right.
like, how do you answer that? And they're like, and they're always like deer in the headlights because usually
Yeah,
people throw that out as a basically I get to define what loving is, and I don't think it's loving to I don't know say
yeah.
something that offends people.
And foundationally, Danny, that's the point to the Christians, Robin, that you're talking to, because I've talked to these Christians for many, many decades. These are Christian leaders. These are seminary presidents, right? Seminary instructors. That's how foundational the problem is. So the only churches that deal with this issue massively in Canada are the Reformed churches, which aren't scared of doing political work, and the
Mhm.
Catholic churches, because that's part of their theology to be involved
Mm-hmm.
in these kinds of issues, rightly or
Mhm.
wrongly. I mean, obviously, I think in this case, rightly, the Catholic Church is doing the right thing. However, when we look at the broader evangelical movement and the churches here, we've taken an approach where we have a hands-off policy in politics now, because of fear, because of lack of love, but also both of these stem from bad theology. We
Mm-hmm.
truly do not understand what being an ambassador for Christ looks like in our time and our culture. And we think the only way to evangelize is to bring people in by making sure we don't offend them. And what ends up happening with these kinds of believers is even if they do become believers, which is very, I think, really rare, no one becomes a Christian because all the other Christians are so nice, right? Because there's lots of nice Muslims and Hindus and atheists as
Yeah.
well. But
No,
even
there
if
are.
they were to become a Christian, as soon as they are offended by something we have to teach because God teaches it through Scripture, they leave, which
Mhm.
tells me they weren't really Christians at all. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, Danny, this issue is a worldview issue. it goes to who's in charge of your world and how do you view that world. And if God is the center of our universe, then killing babies is not something Christians should tolerate,
Yep.
especially
Mhm.
when we're funding it and paying
Mhm.
for it through our taxes.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So I have a follow-up question then. So when it comes to the pro-life movement, obviously in the United States, they chose the path. They chose the path
Mhm.
of, okay, we're going to go after the Supreme Court decision as a way of giving us the power to create the laws that allow us to basically make our own laws in our own states as a incremental way of addressing the issue in the states. Now, Canada has a very different scenario. Number one, there is no Republican Party that even feigns to support the pro-life movement here. Like the Conservative Party has said that they're never going to open it up. None of the other federal parties have done, except obviously the People's Party, but they're really just starting from scratch, so they've got a long way to go. Um, and the Supreme Court of Canada seems to be, maybe I'm wrong, but they seem to be very more of a liberal court compared to the United States court, in the sense that it seems like most of their justices are more favorable to like liberal policies. And so, do you believe that there is a path forward legally by going after the Supreme Court decision, or do you think that there's a different path that Canada should take, at least Canadians should take, in order to make some movement in pro life, legislation in Canada? Jojo, let's start with you.
Well, the Supreme Court of Canada's Morgentaler decision already invited Parliament to make a law. That
Okay,
was
so
right. That was right in their decision.
Mhm.
can you
Justice
unpack that
Bertha
for our
will.
listeners? Because like
Yeah,
I
Justice
don't know a lot of people
Bertha.
know about this.
So when the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the abortion law of 1969, which allowed for certain kinds of abortions,
Mhm.
they invited Parliament to make a new law based on gestational age likely. And if you see some of the videos produced uh, um, uh, We Need a Law and others, they put
Mhm.
together a video series where they invited one of the parliamentary staff at the time to
Mhm.
share his perspective. I can send you guys the link if you'd like to put it up.
Yeah, that'd be
Okay, yeah.
wonderful.
He actually worked on the law, and they had actually been in discussion with one of the Supreme Court justices at the time, or this is
Mhm.
obviously retired, who said that the court would be likely open to a gestational law that would limit abortions later in pregnancy, but allow it in early pregnancy when most abortions happen anyway. And it would be an imperfect law, but it would allow for abortion to be back in the criminal code. So the parliament can still make that law at any time. There's
Hmm.
no legal restrictions for them to make that law. That's why
Mm.
Justin Trudeau's government now wants to create a law to codify legal abortion up to the moment of birth and have you pay for it.
Okay.
So, in terms of the path forward, that has always been a path forward. There's nothing restricting any federal government from doing that or passing that.
Interesting. So
Huh.
basically, the unlike the American law, which made it illegal to create restrictions on abortion at a certain point, you're saying that the Canadian law doesn't actually do that. Like the Supreme Court never did that. That they actually said that,
Here,
okay, well, the Parliament has to make a law, and
right.
Parliament just neglected to ever do
Yeah,
so.
Justice Bertha Wilson, I was finishing my quote there. The most pro abortion judge, the only female judge at the time of the Morgentaler decision, actually said that herself. There's a
Hmm.
gestational time when we can make a law, but not now. What's interesting is the Roe versus Wade decision, Danny, didn't allow for restrictions for abortion. It was actually the companion decision called Doe versus Bolton. So Roe
Hmm.
versus Wade struck down the Texas abortion law,
Mhm.
but there was a similar case that they took at the same time, Doe versus Bolton, and in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that abortion should be allowed for any health reasons.
Yeah, and
So
that's
the
wide
health
open.
reasons could be, it was never defined, was not a medical term, could be anything from the pregnancy is giving me a headache to the pregnancy may kill me.
Hmm.
That was what was allowed. So it was up to each private decision on their privacy,
Hmm.
part of their constitution that allowed for that. So the Casey decision that came afterwards allowed for restrictions for abortions later in pregnancy, but still recognize their privacy rights for abortion. And this is an important legal term, so I'm not trying to get into the weeds here legally because I'm also not a lawyer. But to understand that what the Supreme Court decisions, those three decisions did, Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, and the Casey decision out of Pennsylvania, codified a legal right to an abortion. So that's what was different in the U.S. When Roe versus Wade was struck down in June. That what the courts were saying was there actually is no privacy rights that allows for all kinds of things like abortion. And that's why the left has gone crazy on this, because they've built a whole human rights ideology that they can do whatever they want based on the privacy decision of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And Judge Clarence Thomas actually talked about that in his response to the decision, affirming striking down Roe versus Wade, but also saying things like same-sex marriage and birth control. These are all privacy rights that have been read into the Constitution, and that's not in the Constitution. We can't read stuff into the Constitution.
It's the whole substantive right, substantive due process, right? The idea that there's some inherent rights that are not stated in the Constitution.
So just to wrap up here, to get Robin here a chance, in contrast, the Canadian Supreme Court decision with Morgentaler never recognized a right to abortion per se. It did say women should be allowed to have an abortion. The law was unfair, but it said the Parliament is the right place. That's what Justice Bertha Wilson said for making a decision about when abortion should be available, not the Supreme Court. So that was actually something wise that she said that I agree with. But at the same time, there was no similarly worded, we have a constitutional right to abortion all the time like we have right now.
Okay. Robin, so tell me a little bit. So when it comes to Canadian strategy, have you heard of, like, for example, I've heard a lot about there are organizations that are trying very hard to find, to verify, and to nominate pro-life candidates in a lot of, like, conservative elections. There's a lot of people advocating for pro-life messaging and, like, being sent out. What have you encountered as far as how the pro-life movement works? What do you think is the most effective and should be the most? What ways should we be doing in Canada that you think would be effective?
Well, I would say whatever is most effective, we've not been doing.
Okay.
Because nothing.
Not what we have been doing.
Like, absolutely nothing has happened to restrict abortion in any way, shape, or form, or to take any steps towards abolishing it.
Yeah.
And I do think that we should focus on, like, I think we should to some degree be one-issue voters on this topic. Because if a person is not willing to take, and generally in the Conservative Party, we find they're not willing to state any stance on abortion. Like,
what about Leslie Lewis? What do you think of Leslie Lewis?
She's the best chance we have so far.
Yeah.
But it's still, the things she's offering to do are still only a very slight start.
Yeah.
Like, they are small. She's saying no sex selective abortion, and no it's no sex selective abortion, no international funding of abortion. And I think that's it. If I'm missing something, please.
No, I think that's it.
I would just add, Robin, and that's a very good point. The point that's key is she's willing to come out as pro-life.
Yes.
That's a huge thing as it is, in this kind of culture.
Yes.
And
yeah, like,
the fact that
well, you continue. You continue.
Pardon me?
Please continue, Jojo.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think that is the kind of courage we need right now, and to have a political leader of wanting someone who wanting to lead a party, one of the major parties. We have to support and reward that kind of thinking, especially because the party platform right now, which needs to be reversed, says we can't talk about abortion. What other issue in the world, right, in any kind of Canadian politics, where we have a party platform that says we can't talk about a specific issue?
Mhm.
And just think about that. What if it said we will not talk about Quebec separation?
Yeah.
That's it keeps coming back. The Bloc Québécois, they're in the federal politics, even though it's a provincial issue,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
collecting all kinds of pensions. And this has had two referenda already.
Mhm.
Isn't this issue dead? Like,
Mhm.
why are you guys still talking about it?
Yeah.
They
Just
get
imagine the ludicrousness of a party platform saying we will not talk about a specific issue.
Mhm.
This is, I think, just to give you a chance here, Robin, the key on the political side is courage to speak about these issues, to say we're willing to do it, but also for us as conservative minded voters to say we need to party just like the Republican Party to champion our cause. And
Mhm.
that means the first step is not the political arena per se, federally with all the other parties, but to reclaim the Conservative Party in this case to have it actually be pro-life. I think that's what the Republican Party pro-life activists did in the States
Yeah.
40 years ago. Right? We have yes. And one quote from my thesis that I really think is critical for this as well is that the pro-life leaders at the time when Roe versus Wade did come down in 1973 said we have to stop abortion as soon as possible because the greatest threats is that Americans will just get used to it as
Yeah.
normal.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're seeing in the poll numbers as these as the media has been raising its hackles on this is that people have just lived as if this is normal, as sterilized. We don't talk about the graphic nature of how awful abortion is to babies and their moms, so that it's just a kind of thing where we can wear T-shirts that say "I had an abortion,"
Yeah.
as if that was just
Mhm.
like I bought an ice cream or I bought a
Mm-hmm.
car. Right, they're
Mhm.
normalizing it, and that is why in Canada, simply somewhat having someone say, "No, I disagree with this," to the political Canadian elite, is a statement that says you cannot normalize this, and we need to win the debate within the conservative movement in Canada first if we want to win
Mhm.
on this issue. At least that's, I think, our first step.
Yeah. And
I think you're right. Like I think that in this, I remember hearing a story. I'll just quick story
okay.
on that point, Jojo. I remember reading about missionaries. I think it was Fiji. I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure it was Fiji. They had cannibals, and I remember like when the missionaries first got there, they somehow had to convince the cannibals that it is wrong to eat other people. But they've been doing it for like decades and probably longer than that. They're like, well, why is it wrong to eat people? Like
Mhm.
they're tasty and we can steal their powers. And it's totally this is
Of
normal
course.
here. It's like what's wrong with eating people? And I think we get into that mindset that like we don't realize that something is wrong, especially here in North America, where our laws are so much worse than in Europe. In Europe, you talk to somebody, be like, "Oh yeah, you can have an," and some French person be like, "Are you crazy? What are you, some fanatic?" you know, like they'd be like they would think you're nuts, right?
I
Steven,
love
go
how
ahead.
he tries to like mimic French people. It's not good.
Well, whatever. Be your own Frenchie, Mister
And
Frenchie over here.
well, no, but like what Jojo was saying, I remember having this conversation because Global Calgary had made this post about a pro life float. I believe it was in a Canada Day parade
Oh yeah, I remember
in
that.
Sundre.
No, it was in Red Deer, I think.
No. It was in Sundre, but it was the Red Deer pro life
Ah.
organization that was at this Canada Day parade in Sundre. And
Mhm.
so they were saying to me like, well, many people thought that this was an inappropriate spectacle for children. I'm like, how does the media get off saying that the pro-life movement is an inappropriate spectacle for children? And I was trying to point this out to various people on the thread, and so many people got back to me by responding, kids shouldn't see this because we have to remind people that this is a non-issue in Canada. And it actually boiled my blood a little bit because I'm like, how can we say that the deaths of 80 to 100,000 children per year in Canada that's taxpayer funded, how is that a non-issue to you?
Well, and the question really is, how are you imposing your morality on me? How is that? Because
Yeah.
that's what they're doing with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's usually like the stigma, right? They like to accuse you of the very things that they themselves often are doing. right? It's always about stigma and demonization and all that.
If I could just add one point, I
Of
think
course.
back to Robin's point earlier, and I think what you're saying, Robin, is right on, and what you're doing actually is so critical. If on the political side, we need to start with our own, friends and like-minded voters, then we need to do the same in the church.
Yes.
Right. So the reason why the church, the pro-life movement in Canada and the Canadian legal situation is flailing is because we failed in the church to actually teach our own people properly on these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why CCBR, other pro-life groups have been focusing on apologetics, on training people to think properly on these issues, because this is actually a broader indication of where the church is at theologically about what it believes about
Mm-hmm.
God, about the Bible, about Jesus, and like I said earlier, about loving our neighbors. So I've had many conversations with people who say, I'm a Christian, but we shouldn't be involved in politics. We just need to preach Jesus and they'll convert and then they'll become pro-life. That's not happened historically at all.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of conversion, really, conversion starts with a change in worldview.
Yeah.
So abortion, these kinds of social discussions end up being actually a great way to discover someone's worldview and
Mm-hmm.
to get them to talk about Jesus because you talked about this issue first.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that people don't, Christians are not willing to talk about this issue actually indicates to me that they're not talking to non-believers about Jesus at all
Yeah.
anyway,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't
Yeah.
know
Yes.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I remember hearing it once said that a good stigma defeats a good dogma any day of the week. And the idea is that, like, you can have a very strong pro-life, like ethic and a pro-life apologetic, and you can be very well thought of. Yet, if the very common attack by a lot of pro-choice or pro-abortion activists is they want to stigmatize you. They want to, like, either gaslight you, or they want to accuse your motives, or they want to turn you into the bad guy for, oh, how dare you allow rape, or how dare you support
how.
oppressing women. It's stigma, right? It's the stigma is the always
Mhm.
way. Let me start with Robin. Robin, whenever you have conversations, and maybe this is like maybe good advice for other people who maybe are a little shyer about having pro life debates with other people, how do you approach the attacks, the stigma that is often thrown at you when you have debates with pro-choicers or people who don't who support abortion? What's your approach when they throw stigma at you?
Yeah, so basically the number one thing is that I'm not there to I'm not there to make them like me.
Hmm.
It really doesn't matter, but the biggest thing is just driving constantly at the baby. It's a baby we're talking about. We're talking about a living human child.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever they throw at the abort if they throwing the whole like rape argument, which I think I've heard more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, so a crime was committed. I in no way support rape. I mean, rape is illegal in our country already though. That's not the issue we need to fight here.
Mm-hmm.
But to add on to rape, murder is an atrocity. And
Mm-hmm.
like there's one particular analogy I use quite frequently with that. Some years ago in Alberta, some people may know more details about this than I do because I was pretty young when this happened. But there was an incident when a woman who was being abused decided to take revenge upon her abuser by drowning their two young children in the bathtub.
I think
And
about that.
so she murdered the two children because she was being abused by their father.
Mm-hmm.
And the simple
Hmm.
fact is, yes, she was undergoing stuff which should never have happened to her.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not excuse the fact that she took two innocent lives as revenge for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you cannot excuse a crime based on what the person who is doing it has suffered.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Hmm.
I agree. Like, it's there's a lot of different approaches you can take to that, because Like I like what Lila Rose did in that there's a video between Lila Rose that we mentioned before. One of the approaches she took, it's one that I hadn't thought of. It's the idea that, well, if a young child has been raped, shouldn't we be focusing on the actual trauma, and then that by forcing a child, which a lot of times she is forced and pressured to have the abortion by those in power in her life. Like oftentimes these children aren't given a choice, and that you're adding trauma along with the previous trauma. She was traumatized by the rape, and
And if
a
I
lot of
can
times,
just
yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just comment on that for a moment. So I spent 3 years in the late teens, early 20s, volunteering at a kids camp down in Arizona, and I counseled a lot of girls of some of very young ages who had been sexually abused.
Hmm.
And there were among them those who had been forced to get abortions. And
Hmm.
across the board, they said they'd been forced to. Like,
Hmm.
that those in authority in their life had taken this decision out of their hands.
Hmm.
And they were dealing with twice what they would have been dealing with if they had just been through the abuse.
Hmm.
Because now they're dealing with, they'd been abused by the one abuser,
Yeah.
and then they'd be taken from him to those who should have protected and cherished them, be it
Hmm.
be it their biological parents, if it was like a step parent or whatever situation or whatever it may have been. They were
Hmm.
taken to those who should have protected them, and those people doubly betrayed them by
Hmm.
forcing them to kill their child.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's a
And I
great
mean,
point. Yeah.
to just to add as well, I mean, if again, if I mean, Robin, you're pregnant, Rob, if I understand, right? So, uh,
Yes.
how far along are you, if I could ask?
Um, I'm uh, I'm 16 and a half weeks,
There
and I
you
already
go.
have a 2-year-old daughter as well.
There you go.
So this
So,
ain't my first rodeo.
It's been there before.
but obviously, if that child in your womb is a child, right, then that child doesn't is also a victim of anything the father did to the mom. And so, should we kill the victim for what the father did to
Hmm.
the mom?
Hmm.
That's the question I would ask. Like, that child conceived through rape is also as much of a victim
Yeah.
because she has to live with that trauma and stigma for the rest of her life as the mom. So I it's just as like you said, Robin, everything boils down to what is it? What is
Hmm.
being killed in an abortion? And I think what's critical for your question about stigma, Danny, is to remember that if you're a believer, we already should know and anticipate that rape is
We
going to
know it's
happen.
coming.
What?
Jesus said, "If the world hates me, it's going to hate you too."
But I can
So if
avoid being hated if I agree with the
yeah,
world somehow.
well, you know, I want to make sure Robin
That's
gets a
what they
lot of
say.
time here, but I just wanted to read this quote because it's so powerful. It's from Martin Luther King, the letter from a Birmingham jail, and it's when he was jailed for protesting in Birmingham the rights of African Americans and the right of people to just have justice, to be treated fairly, whatever your race. And what particular his focus of his letter were to the Christian leaders of Birmingham,
Hmm.
most of whom did absolutely nothing to speak out for civil rights. He says, so
Hmm.
often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silence and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. And this is the part that's really important for us as believers. He says, but the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. And really, that is the most damning thing we can say
Yeah.
about the church's response to genocide. Let's just call
Yeah.
it what it is, right? We lose 300 babies every day in Canada, over 100,000 every year, and the government won't even reveal the statistics anymore
Yeah.
because they want to hide how many late-term abortions and abortions are going on in Canada. So three of the biggest provinces don't even count abortions performed in abortion clinics in Canada, even though those abortions are publicly funded. And StatsCan has the numbers of toilets in Canada, but they can't tell us how many abortions we paid for.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right?
on
That's the
purpose.
situation we're in. And Martin Luther King Jr. is right here. What judgment we need to fear most as the church is God's judgment on us, because we know better, but we do just as bad as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think like I'm gonna add one quote on you, Jojo. We're gonna have like a little quote off here because you made me think of one that I love this woman. I heard it. I think I heard it on. Believe it or not, it may have been Louder with Crowder. He brought it up, and I never heard it before. I thought it was great. This is from Abraham Lincoln, obviously with the slavery. Like, you know, when he was trying to talk about slavery, and the question is, he was debating with another man about the morality of abortion. No, not abortion. Of slavery. And this is what he said. He said, but say you, it is a question. Oh, sorry. You do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually superior to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own or skin color lighter than your own. So, in other words, he first started with skin color. If you're going to say that skin color is a measure of what makes it right to enslave someone, the second you meet someone with a lighter skin tone than you, they now have the right to enslave you. And it's like, if you're saying intellect, then if you meet like a black that's smarter than you, he has the right to enslave you. And if you say like, well, it's in my interest, or I'm the powerful one, I'm the one that has the power. It's like, well, yeah, if they get the power, they have the right to enslave you. And the reason I like that quote is because it demonstrates so perfectly, and this is an approach I take very often when debating people on abortion, is the standard. People don't ever stop and think about the standards that they use. If you're allowed to like, you know, kill somebody if they're unwanted. Well, that standard becomes very dangerous because that standard can be used to kill a lot of unwanted people all throughout life. If it's like, oh, they're smaller than me, or I have more power, or I have more power than them, like, well, that standard can be very dangerous indeed. So usually I like to like point out, because what happens in the debate, the abortion debate, is it comes down to either three subsections. Either it's scientific, and usually they like to deny all they want that science says that they're like human beings, but it's undeniable, and so I like to hark on that one. On science alone, the pro-life movement dominates. So what they do is they'll shift from science to philosophy, and they don't even realize they're doing it. They still think they're talking science. It's like, no, you're in philosophy of, oh, well, it's okay to kill someone. They may be human, but it's okay to kill them because they're gonna have a terrible life, or because they're not viable, or all these arbitrary things in this philosophy. And then the final one is usually the religious one. And we can have a debate on all three of those, but we have to recognize as pro-lifers, when they're making a philosophical argument, you have to get back and be like, okay, let's take that standard and let's see how it works in the real world with any other case, because the standard you're making has implications and it will come back to bite us hard if we're not careful. And this is something I'd like to always point out in this debate. Stephen, any thoughts?
No, you guys have been.
We're all over this.
Yeah, you guys have been all over it. So to kind of, as we've been discussing about how to address stigma and address these fairly prominent pro-choice, pro-abortion arguments, but to bring it back more towards the focus on how do we change hearts, how do we change minds, we've been talking about how minimal and how small the pro-life movement seems here in Canada, and how little exposure that it gets in terms of public acknowledgement, in terms of public acceptance. How do we encourage these conversations publicly, and how could we potentially use the church to promote that?
Robin, you want to take that?
Just like,
Sure. Well, they're obviously there are two questions in there. How do we promote it publicly, and how do we promote it with the church?
Facebook.
So it needs to be promoted in the church before it can be promoted by the church.
Mhm.
And I think we've kind of touched on that already, that the churches the individuals within churches need to be awakened to the fact that our nation is streaming with blood.
Mm-hmm.
And just and I think, I do believe, I know some people feel differently about this. The use of going fairly graphic into telling people what abortion really is.
Mm-hmm.
And I
AVP.
think, especially within the church, there should be a knowledge of that, like a knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the brutality of abortion. Like, this should be something that we are chilled and appalled by.
Mhm.
I mean, if we're
Yeah.
going to form an army, we need to know what we're fighting.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
And it's much like in Wilberforce's campaign, they took one thing they did is they took people to slave ships and like
Mhm.
showed them what was being done to these people, like down to the goriest details that the genteel
yeah.
wealthy of the day would never see on
Mm-hmm.
an ordinary life.
Yeah. Well, that's
And
the
then
whole argument about abortion victim photography. And I admit once I was on the fence about this, but now I'm totally in favor of using it. And this was actually the first encounter that I had with JoJo, was when I was at university, and he came by with a group of other individuals, and they had a pro-life display, and I was just like, I'm on board with this. Can I help out in any way? I just want to show up. I got such a lecture from my nursing professor for that. Oof, I got reamed out publicly in front of my entire class, and I'm just like, I don't care.
In your
You
class?
can-
Like in
yeah.
front of the entire
Well,
class?
she made this public declaration. She's like, some of you, and she kind of looks over at me, some of you are part of that pro-life demonstration, and nobody in nursing should be a part of that pro-life movement. It goes
Wow.
countercultural to everything we believe as Canadian nurses. And I just stood up and I said, I don't care, and I walked out.
Well,
Good for you. That's great.
Yeah. You're like,
That's great,
yeah,
Stephen.
what of
Don't
it?
care.
You know, if I could just add to what you're saying, Rob, because you're spot on. Everything you said is absolutely right. I agree with it. But you brought up slavery, Danny, and we need to remember one thing. There was actually one thing people hated more than slavery during that time. All right, did you know that? So in terms of the stigma that we were talking about earlier, people did not want to think about slavery, where they got their cotton T-shirts and how they got their tea, right?
Mhm.
Because every time they wore the T-shirt or they drank the tea, they didn't want to be reminded that
Mhm.
people died to
Mhm.
get them that resource.
Mhm.
So the one thing that was more hated than slavery were the people reminding them how bad
The
slavery
reminders.
was.
The reminders of
The
slavery.
abolitionists.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. So we need to remember that we don't have to take this personally. The attacks, the rabidness, the hatred
Mhm.
is because often these people have had abortions themselves, help their
Mhm.
girlfriends had abortions, and
Yeah.
people love sin because we all love sin. That's why Jesus died, to save us from our sins and the love of sin.
Mm.
So a real Christian will understand that
Mhm.
it doesn't matter if there's a stigma against us speaking biblical truth. A real Christian will understand and think, I will love you anyway. And I will
Mhm.
love you enough to tell you the truth that will set you free. And
Mhm.
so what we actually have here is a loss of passion for
Mhm.
Jesus and his teachings. If we
Mhm.
want to see the church wake up, we need to bring them back to the true gospel, which is
Mhm.
good news for everyone, including for those who are not born yet. If we truly believe that gospel, then we remember that we have a responsibility to live out that gospel. I love this example. It's such a powerful thing. In a book called The Destroyer of the Gods, Larry Hurtado, a Christian historian, asked this basic question: how did the early church grow in the first and second century in ancient Palestine, the very place where they should have been easily wiped out and proven wrong?
Mhm.
And they did two things right, which we need to do in the pro-life movement. They were eyewitnesses to the truth, so they never compromised on the truth. how can you? If you see Jesus walking around after he's crucified, you can't deny that, right? He's alive, right? He's not dead anymore.
Yeah.
And secondly, they had the love of Christ for their neighbors. So one of the things that the early church that we know about, we've heard this a lot of times in church, is that the early church rescued abandoned babies that were left behind. But Larry points out that the vast majority of these abandoned babies were baby girls. And so, because the early church rescued these babies 20 years later, say an ancient Roman town, and a young man is looking for a wife, the only women available, single women
The
available
Christian
in that town
ladies.
were the Christian ladies. And so, in order for them to have a wife, they would have to convert to Christianity. So the early church grew because they stuck to its principles and they understood what they had to do to be different in society. And so that, like you were saying earlier,
Hey,
Robin,
Jojo.
which is absolutely right, the the church now is failing because we're too busy trying to be like everybody else
Yeah.
and not being willing, like you did, Stephen, there to face the stigma and say, I don't care. And I think that's what's really critical for us to be different in our generation.
So, Jojo, you're saying that the early church basically like succeeded because they flirt to convert?
Learn to convert. That's right. It actually works. Well, but you have to understand too. I mean, the life-giving ethic the church gave, whether it was to slaves or to politicians, powerful people, right? We can see the conversion of all those people because we were different, and that was Larry's point. We are no longer different. That's why we're failing.
One of the things I said to because like okay, so little side step, but during the COVID lockdowns and all that kind of stuff, one of the things that I personally did as like what can I do during this time to do my part is I was very adamant and very intentional about emailing and trying to meet with the Christian leaders, hold them accountable. And one of the things when I finally, geez, it took forever to finally get an actual meeting with any of them. Like they were all like, like little like what are they called? Wallflowers. But when I finally talked to one of them, and he said, like, Danny, why is this such a big deal? Like, why is this the hill to die on? And I basically said to him, like among many things, one of the things I said to him is that people will follow your lead. If you take a cowardly stance, everyone will take the same stance. If you take a courageous stand, everyone will follow suit. They follow your lead. If you are leading them wrongly, God is going to hold you accountable for your mistake, because this is why teachers, like it says in the Bible, teachers, if you want to be a teacher, beware, you're going to be judged more harshly because you have more influence on more people. And so as leaders, and particularly in the pro-life churches, you have to be the one that is unyielding and willing to take the strong principle stance, say abortion is wrong. We are not going to back down on this. We are going to advocate for pro-life, no matter how many of our members say no, because a church should never dictate or decide its policy based on what its members want. We're not a democracy. A Christian leader needs to decide, what is God asking us to do? And then once you decide that, you do it despite how people will respond. And if people leave, they will leave. Jesus had a lot of people leave when he told them hard truths, but that is the responsibility. So one of the things I say to people, just let me listen one part. I say, if you're a Christian and you feel you can't do much, whatever church you're in, find all the pro-life people you know, and you need to go and petition your leaders and be like, why aren't you advocating for pro-life issues? And be very adamant. You need to take that courageous, because unless they change, your church culture will not change. Jojo, take it away.
Yeah, no, I think we need to do that. We need to keep putting the pressure on to our church leaders. But I really admire what you're doing, Robin, especially in your own church, because what happens and successfully has happened, and you'll find the most success is when you bypass those leaders, because there are all kinds of reasons why they want to protect the organization more than the cause of Christ. So it's often easier to start, like you're doing, Robin, with the people who are already on side and educate the members first. So it doesn't mean you don't let up on the leadership and providing pressure on the leaders.
Yeah.
But I think in order to move forward,
Hmm.
we need to mobilize
The
the
members.
average person in the pews.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that.
I
Oh,
was.
go
Hold
ahead.
on, Robin.
I
We're gonna...
was just gonna say I was blessed in our church that I did not have to put any pressure whatsoever on our leadership. My pastor actually cried when I said I wanted to start a pro-life ministry.
Great.
Oh,
That's great.
And but so many churches, that is the case,
Mhm.
is that the leadership are simply, yeah, they're not going to be on board. Or if they have vague support, they may be like, okay, you can go and volunteer for so and so if this is what you're wanting to do. But to actually have the willingness to, yeah, to put their church, because it is to some degree putting your church on the line. Like
Mhm.
with Imago Dei Ministries, we are a ministry of Fairview Baptist Church.
Mhm.
If we, and we have been certainly threatened by police officers with legal action against us.
Hmm.
If there is legal
Mhm.
action against us, is the whole church being hit by this?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
And
and that's
just
what it means, a courageous stand.
and
Mhm.
just on that, Danny, I mean, I think to your audience, that's the point. Almost everyone in the pro-life movements that I've met have either started an organization or were people who were go-getters who had to be self-initiating because they didn't often have the support. And this is very much even more true of those of us who are not Catholic or not Reformed,
Mhm.
because we have to start something off ourselves because no one else is doing it.
Yeah.
And so part of that work, hopefully, that we've been able to build at CCB or in other groups, is that there is a network now.
Yeah.
So it's not as bad as it
Mhm.
was, say, 20 years ago when I started. However,
Mhm.
it means we need to be taking this as a personal responsibility. And maybe God
Mhm.
has given you your church to start with. So don't start with the Conservative Party, start with your church.
Yeah.
Right,
Start with
get
your
those
friends.
people active. Yeah, exactly. Get them active, get them started,
Yeah.
get them mobilized.
Mhm.
And just like you said, Stephen, I mean, you saw us the first time at the University of Calgary, right?
Yeah.
Focusing on outreach events where you're reaching out to people, even
Mhm.
in the church.
Mhm.
Having events where, for example, if you have a mission fest, or you have
Yep.
every week during Easter, you've highlighted different ministry that the church is doing. Make sure one of them is a pro-life ministry. Right? Get them to understand this is a critical part of what being a Christian in our society looks like, where we will care for people no one else will.
Yes.
I think the other thing too is I think this is all great because like the idea is like you could start small, you can start within your own group, your own church, your own leadership, and then maybe move on to your leaders. But one thing and this is something I always appreciated about you, Jojo, and so many of the leaders out there, is that because I'm a very intellectual, like like I like to think reasonably, argue shrewdly, all that kind of stuff, right? Little shameless plug there. But
I'm not sure if it was that shameless. Danny. I'm not sure you have any shame with sharing that.
If there's anything I cannot do is subtlety. But but here's the thing: is that so Stephen and I a few years ago, we actually we
Yeah.
did what most pro-life people would not do.
We were the only ones
went
out there.
we went to the belly of the beast to an actual pro-choice rally downtown Calgary, and we were like literally the only people there who were pro-life, and we were like trying to like hide it very well. And once it broke
We did
out,
not
then
hide
we
it
were
very
pro-life.
well at all. We had a sign that says
No, no,
we're
no.
pro-life.
No. We did until they started asking questions, and they're like, "Wait, a second, you're not one of us." And
you were hiding. Tate and I were like, we have a sign that says we're pro-life, and as soon as
you didn't break it out right away.
Yeah, we didn't. We were kind of just like walking and talking, and then eventually they're like, "What does your sign say?" And I flip it over, and they're like, "Leave."
No.
And I'm like, "We'll just go over here."
And then they're trying to block the mouse so nobody can see the sign, and all that.
Oh,
Like, yeah, that's just drawing more attention. Good try.
Well,
But
I laughed so hard. Just a quick follow-up story to that. I laughed so hard, and it was such a moment of the humor of God that 2 years to the day of us doing that outreach and going to the pro-life, or not the pro-choice rally, Roe v. Wade got overturned. I was like, yes!
Prophetic. Thank you. Yeah, you're
Praise
welcome.
God.
You're welcome. Sell us. But the thing is, like, I always say it, like, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, and they say that, like, Danny, how do you come up with this stuff? Because they see me talk to these people. They see me. How do you come up with these answers? Like, I don't have a clue. How do you answer people? Like, they throw out all these little side, side steps and little back and forths, and I'm just right on it. And the thing is, because
Practice.
I've studied it, I've learned, I've reflected. I watch a lot of debates. I do that, and so I encourage a lot of people. Like, if you want to stand and do this well, you need to start and start doing the hard work of learning. Like, there's so many books out there. Scott Lusendorf is amazing. 40 Days for Life. They released a book that gives
What
you
to
all
say
sorts of
when?
documents on what to say when, which is amazing. And there's a lot of literature out there that you can use. The more acquainted you get with this stuff, the more confident you will become, and the more able you'll be able to speak intelligently, confidently, and successfully. Because the only way you're going to change people's minds on abortion is you have to be able to present reasonable, logical answers. You can't just go out there and just, because this is what happens. This is one of the strengths of the pro-life movement, is that pro-choice people have never really taken the time to really think through their points. They think there are no good answers to them. And
Yeah.
so when they meet somebody who has a good answer, they're like, oh, I guess there is a good answer to that. And then at least you're not. My goal is never to, like, win them over to the pro-life side overnight, like in one conversation. If that happens, great. I'll, like, do a little victory dance around.
So rare.
Which me, I will do. But it's more, you want to put the pebble in their shoe, like what's that? Greg Koval. Tactics. You want to put that doubt. Be like, the pro-life side is actually reasonable. Maybe I'm not, and then they start to really think about it.
Maybe
And
I'm
that's
judging
what
them
I want to
unfairly.
do when I try to talk to people. And I encourage people, you need to learn the stuff. These answers are out there. And so this leads me to my next question to both you and Robin. And this is not me trying to be facetious, but I genuinely am wondering, have you actually encountered a very strong pro-choice argument in favor of abortion that you found like, that's a tough one? Like, have you found one? Because in every other, like in climate change, in COVID, and all these, like, I'm like, okay, I can kind of see an argument for that, but I don't think it's a strong one. In the abortion debate, I find that I don't encounter them very often, and I'm wondering, have you guys encountered a strong pro-abortion an argument that you found like, okay, maybe they might have a point? Like, I'm wondering, because I know, Jojo, you run into people all the time in debate. Do you find any good arguments out there?
Are you starting with me then, Danny?
Yes,
Because
let's start
Yeah.
with you, Jojo. Let's do
well,
it.
I want to say, but to your point, I think this is actually the best way to deal with stigma, is to show them wrong through your character, through your mannerisms, and but also through your reason and logic. And the idea, and I've seen this so many times when people come up to us and they think we just have religious arguments, and religious arguments
Mhm.
by definition in their mind are irrational.
Yeah.
There's no foundation or evidence for that. So that's another conversation we can
Yeah.
have. But I've had it where I provide a rational argument for the pro-life view, and then religious arguments now sound more reasonable. because
Yeah.
because ultimately the idea that anyone has human rights, whether they're gay people or women or minorities of any kind, is not a scientific or even a philosophical argument. That's a religious
Right
argument.
on.
That's a
Yep.
moral argument. So the Bible never teaches that that abortion takes the life of a human child biologically, because it's not a biological textbook. But the Bible does teach the value of that human life, even when it starts, like even at the point of its beginning. So we have a foundation both theologically and biologically of why we believe what we do. But to your question about have I ever confronted any tough arguments, of course. Many of these arguments are tough when you first encounter them, especially if you don't have training, especially if you come from a church background where you haven't talked about these issues from the pulpit, and all you've been told is, well, the Bible says abortion is wrong, therefore we shouldn't have abortions. If that's
Mm-hmm.
the only training you've ever received, then you're going to have a tough time in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And,
True.
and ultimately, the argument that we should be able to choose to do whatever we want with our bodies is very compelling to sinful people who want to do what they want to do,
Yep.
and they don't want to follow God's commands.
Mm-hmm.
But the question, and this goes back to your point, if you're trained, not only are you trained to know what the answer is, we also need to be trained in how to give that answer effectively to a secular audience or a secular person. So in my debates with abortion advocates, one of the first questions I ask is the right to choose absolute? Can you absolutely choose to do whatever you want with your body, or are there limits? And if you think through the limits, things like wearing seatbelts, right? That's a limit on what you choose to do with your body.
Yeah.
On having to wear clothes in public, that's a limit on what you can
Ah,
choose to do with your body,
such an
right?
decision.
Is are you anti-choice about that? And
You
we
had
are
that choice about
anti-choice.
that.
I think
No, but
other
we
people
we're
are hoping
Yeah,
that
anti-choice.
we
I
are.
am
We are.
pro-choice.
We're anti-choice
We don't
about
want to
news.
support what's going on in New York right now.
But even something like sexual limits. Are there limits to what the sexual reproductive choices you make? Absolutely. You can't have sex on my lawn. That's illegal. That's trespassing. Right? So that limits your reproductive rights, doesn't it? And so my question then becomes, are you anti-choice about those choices? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
actually responding to a friend, an old classmate, who's made this argument, bodily autonomy. So
Oh
all
my
of the
goodness.
arguments we'll face, and this is true nowadays because of the internet. They've some of them have been around for decades, right? Whether it's theology, whether it's apologetics related, whether it's Christianity, but now they're being rehashed by a new generation, like you said, Danny, that have not spent the time to actually research and do the work and the detail all the things that people have responded to with these arguments. So whether they're the violinist argument, whether they're choice arguments, whether it's a baby, let's kill it anyway because I
Yeah.
have a right to my body arguments, all of those are not new. These are very much rehashed things because frankly, the enemy of our soul, right? The enemy of God, Satan, is not creative. He's corruptive. So he doesn't create new things. He corrupts good arguments. And so he's caused a lot of confusion by doing that. And this is why doing pro-life work is actually helpful for Christian apologetics because you're
Yeah.
actually taught
Mm-hmm.
to think clearly. And in this case, like you said, Dan, it's pretty black and white, right? Are we killing a baby or not? If we're not killing a baby, then all these other arguments make sense. If we are killing a baby, then you know what? It makes no sense because we don't use
Jojo,
this argument for anyone else.
Jojo, it's clearly just a piece of, it's just a pile of goo. That's really what it is. You're only just squishing the pile of goo. I've
Right. And
literally heard that in a debate online,
Yep.
and I was like, "You've got
yeah.
to be kidding
And
me!" They
and
actually
then the
made that
question
argument.
then the question is, what biological textbook are you using to determine that it's just a pile of goo?
It's like, let me
Oh,
My
back you
pile of goo can
up.
kick.
my pile of goo can kick.
That's a
There you go.
solid rebuttal from Robin. So Robin, I'm gonna ask you the same question, but a little bit different. So one of the things I noticed, and I noticed this because we discussed 3 different debates. One common problem and that we encounter as pro-lifers is pro-lifers are trying to persuade the other side about our beliefs. Pro-choice people are often just trying to defend their side, but they're not actually. Oftentimes, they're not trying to persuade you. They're just trying to accuse you and be like you're bad, you're a bad guy. So in that approach, what would be your approach in how to reach out to people and try to change their minds if you feel that maybe they just want to defend their way? Like, do you think there's a point to doing it, or do you think that we're wasting our time?
Ultimately, there are some people who will not be convinced. Like, there are some people who have already set up in their mind that there is nothing on this earth that will convince them.
Okay.
And there can come a point in a discussion where you just it's just
to
time
accept
out.
that.
It's like, this
Yeah.
is not going anywhere. Like, I was very recently in such a discussion online with a woman who, well, I won't get into that, but she was scary.
Robin
Yep.
is solid.
I mean, her views were scary.
Yeah,
Yes.
Robin is like superstar on the online pro-life debates. Part of the reason why I wanted to
But
invite
actually,
her.
I was going to say part of my reason for engaging in online debates, even with people who I know will not be persuaded otherwise, is that there are other people reading these comment threads,
Mhm.
and
right.
those are the people who are not so far gone in evil. They're not
Mm.
so persuaded,
Mhm.
and yeah. So I would say generally in a debate, you usually are not persuading the person you are debating.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You're persuading those witnessing the debate.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mhm.
But I would say, and Jojo kind of touched on this too. The young generation is the should be are the people who we have the most luck in persuading. Although I shouldn't say luck. I mean,
No,
but
it's
at
a
any
general
rate,
rule. It's
we're
a
most
general
successful
rule.
in persuading them because most of them, especially here in Canada, most of them have never heard an articulate pro-life argument.
Right.
Like, we are theoretically, well, okay, it is illegal for us when we are out by the abortion clinic to talk to anyone under 18 years of age. Now, we don't ask them to present ID before we start a conversation, so I can't say we fully obey that. But there's also restrictions. We're not allowed to protest within, I believe it's within 100 meters of a school, which
Mhm.
puts us out of sight
And
of
tiny signs.
any school.
Yeah. Well, somebody. By the way, I want to throw this in. One of the guys we talked to from the States, from the Dank Pro-Life Memes, he's like, we told him like what the rule was, that you could only have like a little brochure size. He's like, well, can you print a whole bunch of little cards that everyone holds up and eventually we make a gigantic placard? And we're like, I don't know, but that's a really good
I
idea.
don't know.
That would actually be a solid solution to that. I'm like, hey, maybe, you know. But yeah, go
I can say our signs are not the size of a brochure.
No, they're
Oh.
very big.
Our signs are the size of a queen bed.
Yeah.
But well, some of them, not all of them.
Yeah.
But
Got to make yourself seen.
but yeah, the reason they have all these restrictions on us being able to expose children to, well, teenagers particularly, to this is because they know that teenagers are not persuaded enough yet.
Right.
And so that's really where we've got to get around this. Like, and that involves getting literature in the mailboxes of homes. And I would use as an example my mom, though this wasn't anything to do with the pro-life cause, but the way she became a believer coming from an atheist home was that Christians came knocking on her door and she just had a fight with her mom, and her mom told her not to let them in, but because she just had a fight with her mom, she
Rebellion.
let them in. And so the rebellion of Gen Z can be used in our favor. Like, they are rebelling against their elders, and we can use that because on the pro-life issue, their elders are, the vast majority of them, take an extremely wicked position.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right, because I think the one of the things that the Canadian government's really pushing hard for right now, and we've all seen this, is they are pushing very hard for censorship of the narrative. Like, this is what the Americans are trying to do. It, they're not succeeding because there's a lot of robust protections. But in Canada, our government's trying to create like all sorts of censorship over online speech. They're trying to create hate law legislation. They're trying to create like what do you call it? Conversion therapy laws, that so like you can't talk to people, and they're pushing the misinformation and disinformation language. The whole idea behind that is that they know that the only way they can keep people in the bubble of these viewpoints that they want them to believe is they cannot allow anybody who's reasonable to talk to them, because if you do, then suddenly they will be convinced, because they know that they cannot. It's a lie, and as long as the only way to keep a lie alive is you have to keep them within the bubble. It's like a cult. And one of the things I like to encourage people, yeah, if we're going to talk to pro-choice people, you have to understand they're like a cult. And I told somebody this, when we went to there was a showing finally in Calgary of Unplanned.
Mhm.
They showed it at Chinook Center, and we went with a whole bunch of our friends, and we heard that there was going to be a pro-choice protest outside on the grass, and me and Steven were like, "Ooh, all right,
Let's go.
let's go." But I had to explain to some people. I'm like, just so you know, once they find out that you're not one of them, they will do everything in their power to. They will ignore you, and they will try to tell others not to talk to you.
Yeah.
It's a cult thing, and we've noticed that everywhere you go, they thrive on the bubble, like complete and total like silence. And so, one thing you have to get used to when talking to groups of pro-choice activists is that they will not talk to you. And so you have to be very ready for that. However, the encouraging thing is if you do find one that will talk to you, you will find that they are actually much easier to convince than you thought.
Yeah.
Because most
They
of the time,
don't really know their own position.
No, they don't.
Most of them. Yeah.
Do you remember that, Steve? That one person
Yes.
at that pro-choice rally when we were when we showed up at that pro-choice rally, I talked to this one girl. She's from the UFC. She asked me a genuine question. She was like, "Why are you here? Like, this is a pro-choice thing. We're here like for our own people and all that. Why would you show up?" And it was a genuine question. I recognize that. And I said to her, I'm like, "Okay, so the way I look at it is you're at university, right?" She's like, "Yeah." Okay, part of university is you want to learn, be exposed to more information so that you can make more intelligent decisions and be wiser about everything from climate change to whatever it was at the time. And I'm like, okay, so why wouldn't you do that with abortion? Like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm totally wrong in the pro-life thing, and maybe I've completely and totally missed the boat. And maybe you guys are right. How would I know unless I showed up here and talked to people who are pro-abortion and listened to their speakers? How would I know? I'm not testing my belief system. I'm just insulating myself. And if I'm wrong, I will never know. And she's like, I don't agree, but that actually makes a lot of sense. And I'm like, and her friends gave her the biggest glare.
Oh.
They're like, "Urgh, urgh," like they just got so mad. And and as soon as I walked away from the end, they're like, "What? Don't listen to him. What is he like?" And I was just like,
Oh. Well, that reaction is so common when you actually make a decent point and they're like, "Huh, that actually makes sense." Like another discussion that we had at that pro-choice rally was those two individuals that were filming us. I think, well, they were recording, and he and I were having this discussion, and he's like, "What is the state of Canadian abortion law?" I'm like, "We don't have any." He's like, "Well, that's not good." And I'm like, "No, it's not. Thank you for like getting some common ground." And then everybody else is like, "How could you say that?"
We can't agree.
Well, it goes back to the reality that we're in right now, which is that in social media, we're encouraged to only spend time with people who already agree with us.
Yep. Echo chambers.
Which allows people to demonize those, which allows people to demonize
So Robin,
those.
just a quick note. There's a mute button on your thing in case you need to talk.
Oh,
It's okay.
No worries. Sorry, Jojo.
No problem. I mean, the point is actually quite good. What you guys are doing is excellent because you're allowing those people to see that you're just people.
Mhm.
Whereas if we don't show up, which is what the church has been doing because we're too busy speaking to each other in our safe subcultures in our church buildings, it's a lot easier to demonize us. It's a lot easier to say, these people have horns and a tail. They want to take away women's rights. They hate all women, right, Robin, including you. Like you hate women, especially pregnant women, right?
So she's self-hating. Robin is self-hating.
Yeah, and we're racist and sexist, all those kinds of things because they've actually never talked to someone who disagrees with them. Yeah. And the media coverage, and I always come back to that because I'm trained in journalism. So I actually have a undergrad in journalism. So I know what they're supposed to be doing, are not even doing that. The number of pro-life people representing our side of things who showed up at any kind of media covering the Roe versus Wade decision last month was hardly any. It was a handful of people, which doesn't make any sense considering the fact that how can you say this issue is a controversial issue and not represent the people who disagree on the issue? Right?
Mhm.
If everyone disagrees on the issue, then it isn't controversial. The decision
Jojo,
should
we don't exist. We're a myth.
right.
We're a
We're
figment of
legend.
your imagination.
We're a
So
figment of your imagination. We're Roger Rabbit.
so this goes back to the reality of our responsibility from 2 Corinthians 5:20 of being ambassadors for Christ.
Yes.
An ambassador does not stay in his or her bubble to talk to other people who already agree with us. An ambassador is equipped to go talk to people who don't agree with us, who don't share our worldview.
Yeah.
And the fact that this is not happening in our churches, not just on abortion, but almost every issue that our culture is facing, means that the church is the one that God will judge, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, for failing to do our job.
Yes. That was exceptionally well put. And it kind of leads into, because as Robin said, that we're kind of finishing up now. How do we take that? Now, of course, we've been talking about how church leaders have failed, how people fail to have conversations because they're afraid of stigma. How do we encourage? Now, of course, the four of us have been involved in pro-life stuff for quite some time, especially you, Jojo. You've been kind of our little secret. We've been looking up to you for forever when it comes to this. And how do we get the person next to us in the pew? How do we get our family members? How do we get our friends? Like even in 2020 when we were talking about going to Life Chain, and I was talking to my parents, I'm like, why don't we go to Life Chain? And they're like, what's Life Chain? I'm like, well, we're pro-life, aren't we? They're like, yeah, of course we are. I'm like, well, let's do something about it. Let's go. They're like, I guess we could go. And I'm like, why are you doubting this? Let's do it. How do you get them from, yes, I'm pro-life, yes, I'm a Christian, to you are claiming you're pro-life, you're claiming you're a Christian, you see the travesty, you see the depravity, you see the destruction of our society and all these issues. How do we get butts from pews to the streets? And Jojo, I'll start with you.
It was just such an awkward way of leaving it. Like you were like setting up for like a bam like thing, and I was like, "Is he done?" Okay, he's done.
I'm built for rants. Okay.
Yes, he is. He's very ranty.
Well, that's why you do podcasts for your rants, right? That's the
we're
fun
all
part.
about the being eccentric.
Right. Well, you know, it goes back to what I said earlier, right? We have to start training our people in proper thinking on these kinds of issues. So spend time having your pastor petition him, ask him to preach on the topic, get him to investigate, provide the research that you have. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know more about the abortion debate than people who don't listen, because that's why they're not here. They don't want to spend time on talking about this. It's hard. And the challenge with that is you have to be willing to love people enough to do the hard things that they need.
Yes.
Right? And I'm not just talking about the babies. I'm talking about those women who got pregnant, those men who want to slack off on their responsibility. I mean, this whole movement, the pro-abortion movement, is fueled by men who fund their abortions and don't want to be responsible for their babies. Right? That's one of the key reasons that the abortion industry is so powerful, is because of that. And it's always funny when abortion advocates make this argument that, you know, what if we forced men to fund babies even while they're in utero? And my thought is that's a great idea.
That's a great idea. Let's go for
it. Your terms are acceptable. But no. You know what they're advocating now, Jojo? They're saying like we should force all men to get vasectomies until they're ready to have families. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me?
I'm not sure if they understand the pro-life arguments.
Yeah.
Right? We're not talking about the pro-life argument is the basic argument that says parents have to be responsible to their children. And one of the responsibilities is to provide the necessities of life.
Yes.
And there's actually it's actually a law in Alberta where if a parent does not provide the necessities of life, the child will be taken away and the parent charged with a criminal or at least a misdemeanor of some sort, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
actually already law. So all we're saying is this law should also apply to preborn children and their
Mm-hmm.
parents, just like it applies to born children, because they're still children, right? That's the point. And that kind of quick thinking, by the way, is again what you said earlier, Daniel, about practice. So if
Mm-hmm.
we want people to understand this, it really goes to the heart of what we have to do as ambassadors. We need to start with daily dialogue, with our
Mm-hmm.
everyday conversations.
Yeah.
And if we can learn to have conversations with our coworker, our classmate, my my classmate from high school who posted a pro-abortion post. She's Jewish. I think she's very thoughtful. She's a very
Mm-hmm.
smart lady. I'd love to continue to engage her
Mm-hmm.
in a
Yeah.
thoughtful way.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit convicted me because I saw this post and I'm like, Lord, I don't want to start this. This is not not worth it.
Lord, why are you
But
tempting
like
me?
but yeah, I couldn't
Interesting.
sleep. And so Robin, like you were saying, right, even if she's not willing to listen, all these people who follow the
Yeah,
post may be willing
they
to.
might just be.
Mhm.
And
But
and so that's the last piece of advice is be brave enough to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I will add one thing to that, Jojo. Is like, and again to Robin, I agree. With Robin, sometimes you can't convince a person, so maybe the people that are listening. But also, here's the other thing I found that I've started to add to my reasons for why I engage is you need to provide a counterbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
If people are just spewing, and there's no counterbalance, people will believe, oh, this is like general like common sense. Until you have somebody saying no, you're wrong, and here's why. They'll always believe that their position is unquestioned. Like like Stephen said, like oh, that's not an issue in Canada because they believe that it's like there's a Bible verse in Proverbs that says, "Don't answer a fool according to his folly, or else you'll become like him." But then it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be convinced of his own."
Yeah.
Like the verse says. But yeah, sometimes you need to be able to provide that counterbalance and be that person that says, "No, I think you're wrong. Here's why." And usually they'll pile on you, but they will see there is actually people who disagree,
Mm-hmm.
and that will completely change even just the worldview of thinking that this is an uncontested worldview. That's
Absolutely.
that oh, there's no disagreement here. Everyone believes everything I do, and believe it or not, there are people who truly do believe that there is no disagreement on this, that everyone agrees with them, and you can be that one person that can show them, no, actually, no, not everyone agrees with you, and here's why. And I love to be that person. That's definitely my
And just quickly,
bear.
we have to remember it took 200 years to abolish slavery in the British Empire.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a lot of conversations.
Mhm.
And that's a lot of pamphlets, like you were talking about, Robin, showing the graphic images of boats and slave ships.
Mhm.
That's a lot of Christians being losing their reputation and being hated by their neighbors because they
Mhm.
said the very thing that would offend their friends, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of lost friendships of that, but
Yep.
no one looks back and says, "Oh, well, that wasn't worth it." Right? No,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
slavery had to be abolished. And it was in the Christian worldview. Yes, there were Christians involved, but in a Christian country, it took 200 years. I mean, in other countries, let's just other religions,
Mm-hmm.
it took much longer, if at all,
If it
Hinduism.
all
right?
still going on.
In
Mhm.
Hinduism,
Still going
they held
on
on
in
to it.
some
Still
places,
going on in
right?
the belief system. I
Right.
like
So,
I like to think of it like the like somebody give the example of a tipping point analogy, because if you think about it, what you get the impression is that it's super slow, that it's taking forever, but it's like a tipping point. Once you get to, it's like when online you talk about something going viral. Until something goes viral, it's super slow to get there and it takes forever until it reaches that tipping point. And then suddenly it like the dam bursts, and it suddenly you get all the momentum in the world. And I
Mm.
think that's what happened with slavery. That's what happened with the civil rights movement in the States, women's rights. Once something reaches that tipping point where everyone suddenly, like, they're all like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, this
Yeah.
is terrible. It unleashes so I like to encourage people in telling them that all of these movements took time. They were very slow. A lot of people probably thought like they'd never get there until you get to that tipping point, and everything goes like suddenly unleashes and all that, and then suddenly everything changes. I think I remember the story of that
yep.
one. You probably know who this is, Jojo. In the U.S., there was an incident A young boy went from the South, from a northern state to a southern state of the Civil War, Civil Rights era, like the Jim Crow era, and I guess he winked or he smiled at a young lady,
He
and
whistled. It was
he
whistled.
Yes.
whistled,
Oh,
and the man, like I don't know, the husband or the brother or whatever, they basically found this boy, lynched him,
lynched him.
and threw his body in like a ditch or something like that. And the mother kept her son in an open casket so people could see the brutality of what had happened. And now one action unleashed a fury of reaction that essentially a lot of people believe is what led to the explosion that was the civil rights movement.
Well, Rosa Parks was asked why she refused to get off the bus, and she said, "I was thinking of that poor boy Emmett Till, 14 years old. That's who you're talking about." No, absolutely. I think I want to make sure, Robin, you get the last word here, but the Roe versus Wade decision that this whole podcast is based on had the exact same trajectory, right? It was a group of people who started saying we need to build a case against Roe versus Wade that it's actually not, there is no constitutional right to abortion. The right to privacy does not guarantee you the right to kill someone, so it doesn't guarantee you the right to abortion. And because of the training that people like Scott Klusendorf provided, gave the intellectual and philosophical fortitude to get these young people to go into law or get into politics. If you trace many of these people's background, they got training in pro-life apologetics before they brought this case to bear. And because of that, now we had a situation where we had enough Supreme Court justices to overturn Roe versus Wade. So the intellectual foundational backgrounds, which is what the pro-life movement has as its greatest strength, we actually believe what's true, right? The abortion advocates believe what they think is true, but it's really, like you said earlier, it's all about power for them. It's our right. We have the power over this being inside of us. Therefore, we have a right to terminate this child. Right? That's their worldview, but that's not true, and it's not philosophically sound. And so we need to understand even the Roe versus Wade decision was 50 years almost of hard work of people doing the kinds of things we're talking about, building a strategy, thinking through what we need the next move is. Because abortion is still legal in the US. There's still going to be another 50 years or more for every one of those states to protect the right of children to live in the womb. Right. But we've laid a foundation, and I think this is a good example for Canada of what we need to adopt, the strategy we need to adopt, and also to understand too what doesn't work.
Robin, what do you think is the strength? And so, what are the greatest strengths of the pro-life movement? Do you believe, or at least the pro-life position? And what are the greatest weaknesses of the pro-abortion position, in your view? And particularly with like encouraging people in Canada, on the pro-life side.
Well, I mean, this of course will only appeal to Christians, but the greatest strength is that God is for us. But the greatest strength of the debate is just as has been mentioned before in this discussion, we do have the whole of science behind us. Like everything, all the facts point to our side. And yeah, I would say like especially now because like we have way more advanced ultrasound technology. Heartbeats are detected much earlier now than they were not too long ago.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And the evidence is very compelling. Like we have, I mean, you guys have probably seen Teardrop Baby, it's called. It's like a little 5-week gestation baby. Had to be tragically removed because of an ectopic pregnancy. But that it's totally a baby already. And by the 5-week point, most women are just realizing they're pregnant.
Right, of course.
If they've realized it yet at all. And so we've got enormous amounts of facts behind our side. And enormous amounts of research too, because like there have been so many people who have put in so much work, like you, Jojo, to just research and research and research on this and pile it up for us. There's
Mhm.
no shortage there. And then on the pro-abort side, I would say their biggest weakness is that their argument is all based on emotion. Like it really is. And I know that can sound a bit harsh, but it really is emotionally based. Like when you say, what about, I mean, to use a thing that's been popping up in the news like crazy, although whether the story is actually verifiable is very controversial now. If you say, what about a 10-year-old girl who's been raped
Mhm.
and needs an abortion?
Mhm.
Always bring that up.
That's going straight at the emotional.
Mhm.
And we just cannot let emotions govern our ethics. Like,
Mhm.
that's not the way it works. But yeah,
Mm.
that's.
I think like it's like paper rock scissors. A good emotional appeal will always fail against a good intellectual, reasonable appeal.
Mhm.
Because like
Mhm.
I saw this today with that debate between Lila Rose and the other lady. I sorry, Stephen, I can't remember her name. Whatever, Brenda, what's her name?
I will look
It
up
must.
her last name for you.
Okay, fine. We can pull it up. But like she was making all these emotional appeals and all these like flawed approaches and all that. So like one of the things I say to people, both with apologetics, Christian apologetics, but also with pro-life apologetics, is that the more you learn, the more confident you are, and the more efficient and successful you can be in having these conversations. So I always say to people, I mean, yeah, it's daunting because it's big. And I will say this, it can be difficult to talk to them because they have been told what to say. They're just repeating talking points,
Mhm.
and they will throw them out, and they feel like they have nothing to prove, and so they'll just throw these out, and they'll always accuse you. And so while we do have the answers, we can have very good answers to these questions. You still need a little bit of skill to be able to navigate them. Sometimes you have to make a choice. Am I going to follow that track, or am I going to ignore it because it's just going to lead nowhere? Because one of the things that I know, they always try to point to religious. You're like, oh, well,
Mhm.
you're a Christian. How can you like hate women? And I'm like, I'm not going to take that bait because you don't care about religion,
Yep.
you don't care about Christianity, and anything I talk about with religion, you're not going to. So I'm
Yep.
going to focus on the actual thing at hand, right? And so I think pro-lifers have, yeah, the odds are against this, but like Jojo mentioned earlier, in the early church, the odds were against Christians there too. And if we really truly believe that God is on our side, like remember, God is the one who gives us success, not ourselves, not our own efforts. It's whether or not God will is whether or not they'll succeed. And again, it'll be slow and meticulous. And the best thing you can do, I always tell people, you know what? Start by going online, look up some of the big names in the pro-life movement, like Scott Klusendorf, like Laura Klassen, like Stephen Green, like yeah, I know. I'm messing with you.
Not me.
Look up the big names and look up their material, look up their speeches. Just listen, and you will find you will learn most of the things you'll need just by listening to
Mhm.
their speeches, their activism, their interviews. If you want a great person that talks about this all the time, Jonathan Van Maren has a podcast. He always talks about this stuff, and he is great.
Cam
Um,
Cote has a podcast.
Cameron Cote, if he was here today, I'd be giving him like and
He
all
will be
that.
here
So like,
sometime.
one day. But yeah, so just listen, and eventually you'll get there. It is doable. Stephen and I have shown it. Robin's definitely on that top trajectory there, and JoJo is king of us all.
King of us all.
Hardly. That's not the case. I think if to your point, and the last thing I'd mention here as we wrap up is, especially for those of you who are church leaders, or if you're pro-life leaders, what you will have to do is invest in the next generation and clone yourself. This is the kind of cloning I do support, where you find people who are ready and eager to do what you're doing, and who are willing to step up and are brave,
Mhm.
and you invest in them,
Yes.
because that's what I've always done. That's how I've been trained as well. So I don't need to focus on all the people who know my name or things like that, but I can focus on making sure the next generation is equipped. Just a quick anecdote. I was speaking to a member of parliament, and we were chatting about pro-life strategy. He was a Christian member of parliament, and he said, well, "So what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Oh, I teach apologetics. That's my job." And he said, "Oh, the best trained people are the people who are from this pro-life organization. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, called the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform. All their people are so well trained; they become great staffers. They know all kinds of arguments. Maybe you should work with them," he said to me. And I thought, great. And so I finally had to say, I started that organization with Stephanie Gray and other people, right? And he had no clue. And the fact of the matter is, that's okay. He didn't have to know that I was involved in starting that. What he had to know was exactly what he did know, which is that the people who go through that organization are the best trained
solid
people.
Solid people.
That's right.
I feel like I have to join them just even for like a little short while, just to get that that kudos on my resume. Be like, yeah, part of that. I was part of that.
Well, I had the initial meeting with Cam for volunteering, and then it just back then, of course, we had 2 kids and we were not quite as busy as we are now, but we were busy.
Yes.
But yeah, like to what Danny was saying, just to finish up, if you're reluctant to get involved, if you're reluctant to say, I know that I'm pro-life, but I'm afraid of what other people might think. I know that I'm a Christian, but I'm afraid of what will happen if I go out and publicly declare these things. Danny's saying, yes, like the odds are stacked against us, but they're stacked against us only from a worldly perspective.
Yeah.
Any other perspective, the odds are so thoroughly stacked in our favor, it's not even close.
I was going to quickly add there, Stephen, God and us, God and me make a majority. Right? That's
yes. That's very true. That's very true. So we have to be looking past the short term. We have to be looking for the long term, and we have to be striving to be bold and courageous, not only for the unborn, but for our faith in every encounter that we have and in every day of our lives.
Amen, brother. Amen. Preach it.
All right. We've been going on for nearly 2 hours, so that's what we're going to wrap up for today. We thank Jojo and we thank Robin so much for coming on. Woo! The conversations that we've had today were illuminating, they were enlightening, and they set us up for the future conversations that we're going to have and for future events that we're going to go to.
You got me set up. Set me up.
I know.
Yeah.
So, October 2nd. October 2nd is Life Chain. I don't know where it's going to be yet in Calgary, but that's the day.
It's going to be on the streets.
We're going to be there. We're going to be talking to people. There's probably going to be people who are against us.
And we will rush to interview them.
Danny and I will be like, run to those people.
Last time, remember, like Stephen, we went to one way back at the beginning
the Life
of our
Chain
podcast, and then there was a guy who was literally screaming from his motorcycle at the people who were doing the thing, and so he was so mad he ended up losing control of his motorcycle and ended up in the curve. And we're like, well, that serves you right.
Well, no, that wasn't the end of that conversation because you were interviewing. Okay, little anecdote. It was hilarious. Okay. So Danny's interviewing somebody at Life Chain. I'm filming. There's this guy on the motorbike, and he's revving, trying to like overwhelm the microphone so that nobody can hear the conversation that we're having.
Yeah,
doesn't work because it just doesn't. The microphone thankfully picks up all the conversation that we had, but he loses control and he tags this guy's Corolla.
Yeah,
the guy in the Corolla and him go to a bank parking lot and get into a fist fight. And so, eventually. It got really bad, and so my wife and this other guy go over, and they're trying to talk these 2 guys down, and this guy in a Jeep goes over, and the guy in the Jeep gets out of his Jeep, and he's jacked, and he picks up the 2 of them, stop it! And then he just drives off. So we were just dying. It was so funny.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't have experienced it if we hadn't been out at Life Chain. So come out to Life Chain.
That's right.
Not to experience a fight,
Yeah.
but to support the unborn.
Don't worry about the pro-choicers. We will find them and we will take them. You can just kind of focus on Life Chain because it's true.
Yeah.
Like when we went to the rally, the
Yes.
protest here. Whenever there was like some kind of a big debate on the side of the street, I'd be like, "There's a debate going. I'll see you later." And I go around.
There's a debate going.
I want to get involved.
Yeah.
I want to talk to them about whatever they're talking about because I'm like, that's the thing. I'm not kind of personality. I'm willing to have those tough talks.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you have somebody who's willing to have those conversations, it's exciting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I actually get like really pumped whenever I get there.
Yeah.
So.
All right. So, bit of a segue. We'll move back. Now we're going to finish up for real. So, if you want to follow and support JoJo or Robin with their various organizations, JoJo, how can our listeners, our viewers watch or support you?
Sure. Right now, I'm with Free to Care. So that's FREETOCARE.ca. So we deal with issues on sexuality and gender mostly, but I'm still doing a lot of apologetics presentations on a whole bunch of issues, including on abortion.
Cool.
So if this is an issue you need some training or apologetics teaching on, let me know. I'll be glad to provide that kind of support for you.
Okay.
And Robin, how can people like what kind of things are you into, and how can people support you? If you want to get involved in like what you're doing with the
With Imago Day.
Yeah.
So the main thing people can do is start one of their own, like in their own church. Yeah, as mentioned before, just pull together those who are pro-life in your church and get something started. Like you don't have to have piles of funds behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Our first signs were made on the backs of or made on sheets of dollar store that white foam board stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
They cost like
fancy.
$1 each.
$1, yes.
And
Yeah.
so you just get something started and see where God takes it. Get it
Amen.
started with prayer.
Amen.
And you don't know where it's going to go. And then just to pray for ministries like mine. Pray for those who are going out in the streets, and pray for those who are reaching out to women, that the women will come, that they will choose life and not death. And yeah, financially we are well supported by our church, which is wonderful.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right.
That
Well,
is.
thanks so much, Robin.
Yeah. All right.
So
So
people know who we are. We're the Shrewd Dudes.
yes, we've been doing this for over 2 years now.
It's been a while.
Yeah, we always like to remind you that at the Shrewd Dudes podcast, why be rude when you can be shrewd? Thank you everybody for watching. Thank you everybody for listening. We will see you on Tuesday for our regularly scheduled Tuesday News Day.
Yeah.
Until then, have a great weekend, and as always, God bless.